Good morning. We're here doing chapter 3, Max, the Incredible True Story. I'm going to backtrack one paragraph because I got interrupted by a phone call and a knock at the door yesterday, so sorry about the abrupt ending. All right. George and I were spending a weekend at Big Bear Lake. We walked around the lake, enjoying the peaceful autumn day. The air was already cool. Although the sun was still shining brightly, the pine forest surrounding the lake was quiet. It was the time of year when summer vacationers were already gone, while the ski crowd had not yet invaded the village and the surrounding countryside. The path, covered with a thick layer of pine needles, was soft under our feet. Maxie, a puppy of 6 months, was running among the trees, chasing the fat squirrels who angrily chattered at him from the safety of the higher branches. Maxie's ears were still bandaged with white surgical tape after cropping. He looked like a comical black devil, with the white horns of his taped ears forming a stiff V. We were alone in the forest, or so it seemed, when suddenly a tiny fluffy puppy appeared from nowhere. It followed us, playing with Maxie. They chased one another in and out of the bushes, the puppy showing no inclination to return to wherever it came from. She was a fat butterball with the most beautiful dark eyes, and she couldn't have been older than 8 or 9 weeks. How did she get here? We wondered. It's miles away from the village. She doesn't look neglected. She's clean and fat. We yelled and whistled, expecting at any moment that someone would appear from among the trees to claim the puppy. But the forest was quiet, save for the rustle of pines. The puppy continued to follow us, friendly and trusting. Obviously, we could not leave her alone in the forest when finally we decided to turn back. It's getting late. Let's ask in the village whose dog she is, George said. Perhaps someone will know. We turned around and headed for the village. Suddenly, I found myself thinking that I wished we would not find the puppy's owners. I fell in love with the fluffy creature, so lovely, so gentle, so eager to offer herself to us. Secretly, I hoped that she was an abandoned dog and not just a lost one. You know, I almost wish that she would turn out to be an abandoned puppy, George said to me. Look, just look how she plays with Maxie. I wouldn't mind at all if we were to keep her. I burst out laughing. I was thinking exactly the same. You've read my mind, I exclaimed. As we neared the highway and the village, we put Maxie on the leash. George took off his belt and made an improvised collar and leash for the puppy. She protested the wide leather around her neck, jumping sideways, trying to slip out of the collar, but failing to do so, she gave up. Walking with us obediently, fighting no more, showing her inborn intelligence. The village was deserted, most of the summer people gone. We stopped at the grocery store to inquire about the owners of the puppy. No one knew anything about her. The service station operator knew nothing either. Lots of people abandon their dogs at the end of the summer, he said. Should we ring the doorbells or shall we satisfy our conscience with what we have already done and presume that she was abandoned by some thoughtless people? George asked rhetorically. We shall consider our conscience satisfied and keep the puppy, I said. She was abandoned by her owners and she chose us to be her family. We can't betray her trust. So be it, George declared. The dogs, Maxie and his new companion, had no doubt about the outcome of our decision. Tired after the long walk and play, they cuddled together as all puppies do and were fast asleep on the rug in front of the heater. We named the new puppy Mila, a diminutive of an ancient Russian name, Ludmila, the beloved of the people. She grew up into one of the most beautiful dogs I had ever seen. She was fluffy as a Siberian husky, and perhaps she was part husky. She also resembled a wolf, and perhaps She also resembled a wolf. Her ears stood erect, and her expressive, soft eyes were encircled with dark lines, like eyeshadow. If there were equivalents in animal beauty to the movie stars, our Mila was equal to Elizabeth Taylor in her prime. She and Maxie were inseparable. They slept together and shared the same doghouse. They played and chased one another around the house or dug deep tunnels in search of gophers in the country. When the dogs were grown, Mila raised her litter of puppies sired by Maxie. Then soon after the puppies were weaned, George had to attend a medical convention in Europe, and I was to accompany him. We decided that the dogs would stay with the Abbotts, a fine English couple who cared for our country home. They were always glad to have Max and Mila to keep them company. Alas, when we returned 3 weeks later, there was no Mila. She had been killed instantly on the highway by a speeding car. Now our Maxie, too, seemed to be gone from our lives. The following morning, Friday, we drove back to the village. Our notice about Max was still at the post office. We stopped and talked to every national park employee that we met, repeating our descriptions of Max. We visited the ranger station. We walked up and down dozens of different trails, calling, whistling, all to no avail. Let's stay here for a couple of days, I suggested. Tomorrow is Saturday. It will give us an extra 2 days to search for Maxie. We can return home Sunday. Friday went by with no results, and with dusk we returned to our motel. We took Hildy for a walk at the river, but she stayed close to us, showing no interest in chasing the boys or trying to catch the swift little waves and rivulets. The next morning we returned to the park. The employees had begun to recognize us, asking whether we had any luck. No, no luck, we replied. People shook their heads sympathetically. You'll find him, they encouraged us, but there was no conviction in their voices. Again we walked for miles. Nothing. We stayed at the park until darkness, refusing to give up, but by Sunday we all knew that we could do no more. We loaded the car, paid our bill, and prepared to return to Los Angeles. Max was gone. Max was dead. Still, a tiny ray of hope was flickering in my mind. Sir, will you please call his number? This number collect should anyone from the Capers, should anyone from Sequoia National Park call you about our dog? I asked the motel manager. I'll be glad to. Sorry that you lost your dog. It must have spoiled your vacation, he said kindly. I know exactly how you feel. I have a dog myself, a poodle. He's like a child to me. Our drive back to the city was torture. Many hours of driving in slow-moving traffic, just what we wished to avoid by careful planning. The beautiful orange groves, the blossoming apple orchards, the long stretches of olive groves ceased to enchant us. Reminds me of Spain. Remember those miles of olive groves? George asked, his voice lacking interest either in olive groves or in Spain. I remember, I replied. For the rest of the way we were silent. Francisco climbed into the back of the station wagon to keep Hildy company, as if understanding why he did it. She licked his face and hands and snuggled to him, both of them falling asleep, lulled by the monotonous song of the wheels. We stopped for a meal at a roadside restaurant, and I called back to the ranger station at Sequoia National Park. What if they had found Maxie? Would we turn around and dash back? But no such luck. Back at home, Hildy sniffed around the house, going from room to room, searching for Maxie. That night, locked in the laundry room where she used to sleep, sharing the same rug with Maxie, she cried and whimpered until I broke my own rule and allowed her to sleep in my room. But by the next day, she seemed to have forgotten about Maxie. She played joyfully with the boys and chased the neighbor's cat up the tree, behaving as if nothing ever happened to disturb our peaceful routine. But we humans could not dismiss Maxie's disappearance that easily. We talked about him constantly, recalling every detail of his short and happy life. Remember how we almost got into trouble with our neighbors on account of Maxie's thievery? George recalled fondly. What trouble? Tell us, the boys begged. You tell him, George said. You're the storyteller. Oh, okay. Well, last year, before we bought Hildy, Maxie used to be very mischievous. He used to visit our neighbors and steal things from them. Maxie, a thief? Carlos, the more righteous of the two brothers, could not believe his ears. Yes, our noble Max was a thief, I said sadly. A former thief, George corrected. That's true, I agreed. His theft was discovered just in time, and he was not allowed to pursue his criminal tendencies. What happened? Francisco reminded us, interested only in the action and not in a discussion of criminal tendencies. Well, one day we noticed a strange swimming trunks on our patio. They didn't belong to George, and they were caked with dirt as if someone had dragged them through the mud. We threw them into a trash can. Then, a few days later, a bath towel appeared in the garden. Again, it was not one of ours. I asked the gardener if it was his, but he said that it wasn't. Neither did it belong to our housekeeper. I shrugged my shoulders and told her to use it as a dust cloth. A few more days passed, and another item found itself mysteriously on our front lawn. This time, it was a sailing cap. No one suspected Maxie until one day I saw him staggering under the weight of a big woolen blanket that he was trying to carry in his mouth. He stumbled and struggled as he was dragged it along the sidewalk and into our garage. The boys laughed, and even George and I smiled, recalling the capers of our larcenous dog. We knew then who had been bringing all those odd items home. George took over the story, but we didn't know how to deal with the situation. We didn't even know from whom Max had been stealing. You could have advertised, Francisco suggested. Are you stupid? They would have been sued by anyone who had ever lost anything, Carlos objected, displaying a legalistic turn of mind. George smiled. He liked the boys. You're right, Carlos. We couldn't advertise. The best bet was to ask the neighbors whether any of them were missing a blanket and pretend that we knew nothing about the smaller items. Besides, the smaller items no longer existed, Carlos reminded. The towel became a dust rag, the sailing cap you gave to the gardener's son, and the swimming trunks you threw away, Francisco added. So there was no evidence of Maxie's criminal record except the blue blanket. George continued. We were lucky, and we were saved the embarrassment of searching for the blanket's owner. Just as we were contemplating searching the neighborhood, we heard an irate voice from the other side of the brick wall, separating us from our neighbor. Where in the heck is the blanket? I put it on the diving board this morning. The boys laughed, and we joined them. The next thing was to decide how to return the blanket. Should we just march into their house and present them with their blanket, admitting our dog's guilt, or should we sneak the blanket over the wall without saying anything? Over the wall, the boys shouted. Right, that's exactly what we did. We couldn't compromise our Maxie before the whole neighborhood, could we? So what did you do? The practical Carlos queried. Oh, it was a real cloak and dagger affair. George pulled on his pipe as a mischievous smile of recollection curled the corners of his mouth. We waited for the dark. Then I carried a ladder to the wall and peeked over it into the neighbor's garden. No one was there. Right under the wall, there were thick bushes of azaleas planted about 2 feet away from the wall. I dropped the blanket down, and it landed neatly between the plants and the wall. The deed to cover up for Maxie was done. The next morning, after George had left for his office, I heard the shouts from the neighbor's garden. I found it, a woman was shouting. Where in the heck was it? Right there in the bushes. How did it get there? I have no idea. Are you sure that you put it on the diving board? Of course I'm sure. I was sunbathing on it. Why would I stick it behind the bushes? Don't be stupid. The boys giggled. It must have been funny listening to them, Carlos said. It sure was. Although we felt a little guilty too. Not only did our dogs steal their blanket, but we caused them to quarrel on account of it, I said. Oh dear, what we don't do for the sake of our children. Your dogs, you mean, Carlos corrected. They are. They're children, Francisco came to my defense. Their real children are all grown up. What happened later? How did you teach Maxie not to steal? Carlos asked. He wanted to stand up. Skipped a page. Well, obviously we couldn't shame Maxie into confessing his guilt and promising never to do it again. So instead we raised the fence in the dog's yard a couple of feet so that he couldn't jump over it into the neighbor's garden. It seemed to do the trick. As he grew older, he became wiser and was satisfied with his own toys. Or with your bedroom slippers, I reminded George. He used to carry your slippers into the doghouse. And chew them? Asked the boys. No, just carry them into the doghouse. But when we bought Hildy, he stopped doing it. He had no time left for stealing, George chuckled. Hildy became his sole preoccupation. He had to guard his nose from her needle-sharp little teeth. We all fell silent, thinking of our handsome rascal, Maxie. Carlos began to paste Maxie's snapshots in a large black album. It's Maxie's memorial, he announced solemnly. Not yet, cried Francisco. We might find him yet. Maybe he's still alive. He is dead, Carlos pronounced with finality. Yes, he was dead. We had to get used to that. Somehow, neither George nor I could accept the idea that Max was lost or stolen. Oh, I'll pause right here. I forgot to dedicate this chapter. I wanted to dedicate this chapter to Otto, who was always willing to help us, willing to help with the computer, willing to help when we need a hand, and being almost the second teacher in the classroom. All right, we'll keep going. Max lifted his head and whimpered. He did not recognize his surroundings. He sniffed the air, but the scents were all unfamiliar. He smelled only the damp, decaying leaves that kept gathering from one season to another in the hollow spaces between the rocks. It was dark, and Max instinctively knew that something was wrong. He shouldn't be here among the rocks, shivering from cold, all alone. He should be somewhere else, in a warm house or a car, with his masters and his young companion, the playful puppy Hildy. Here's another picture, very few and far between. He wanted to stand up, but immediately the sharp pain in his front paw made him stagger. Losing balance, he fell on his flank. Dimly, he recalled a happy outing in the woods. 2 children, not the usual members of his household, but fun to be with nevertheless, his masters and Hildy walking along a cool path. He's straining to be free of his leash. Then he remembered running after a swift squirrel, and then he had had a feeling of flying or falling down very fast, and then nothingness. He did not know how long he had been unconscious. Perhaps a couple of hours, a few days. How long was a dog to tell the passage of time? He only knew that it had been a long time since he had had anything to eat or drink. He was starved and parched for thirst. He tried to move again, but the terrible pain in his front foot caused him to yelp. Max licked his paw tentatively. It felt painful even under his soft, moist tongue. He whined again, his nerves tense, hoping to hear the soothing voices of his masters, who always responded to his call of distress. But all that his sensitive ears could hear now were the unfamiliar sounds of the forest at night. Intuitively, Max knew that he had to wait until morning. He whimpered like a puppy and tried to make himself comfortable, but his paw kept throbbing, making it impossible for him to settle down. He kept licking it, the salty taste of his own blood mixing with that of saliva, dripping freely from his red tongue. He finally fell asleep, his body trembling from cold and his senses numb from pain and the lack of food. When Max awoke some hours later, the rays of the sun warmed him. He felt better, and his thoughts immediately turned to food. Was he hungry? He yawned and stretched. At once, the severe pain in his paw made itself known to him. He cried sharply, but the echo only returned his cry. Max struggled to his feet. He knew instinctively that he had to get home. He did not know where his home was, nor how long he had been away from it, but he knew that he had to find it. Max limped on 3 legs, sniffing the ground. He searched for familiar scents, but found none. There were plenty of smells, to be sure. The frightening, foreboding sense of wild animals, but nothing familiar, comforting, or friendly. He sniffed the bushes, searching for the odor of his own urine. It is a sign that marks the boundaries of an animal's territory or marks the way home. But all that he could smell was his own scent near the place where he first had regained consciousness. Max did not know how long he had been lying among the rocks, with his front foot broken, but his aching body and his empty stomach told him that it must have been a long time indeed. We will stop right there. Always remember, it's cool to be kind. Hard work makes you feel good. And ask your folks, what can I do to help? Have a great day. Ciao.